Okay, let's get started. Hello and welcome to today's panel. As the title suggests, we're going to be talking about quite a controversial issue that came up in the community recently. Elastic's change of their license from an open source license to a source available license. It's caused quite a bit of controversy within the community, and we've seen a great deal of responses ranging from the ecstatic through to the utter despair. So with the aim of this panel is to help dispel some of the myths around this license change and give everybody a really clear picture of what's going on and hopefully put some minds at rest. Start, what's actually happened? So Elastic have changed their license around Elastic and Kibana. What this means is that they're no longer open source solutions. Because of this, this may impact how you choose to engage with the software, but it also may impact how you decide to spend your time contributing pull requests and such, fixing bugs. So just to get us going, Ariel, how about you get us started with the history? So how did we actually get here, and what's occurred to get to this point? Oh, and of course, introductions first. Ariel, you can start. Sorry.
So I'm co-founder, CEO of Coralogix, and with us is Gal. Gal, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Gal Eshet. I'm a partner at Herzog Fox Niemann at the high-tech department. I was most of my career was in Silicon Valley. Moved back to Tel Aviv about 4 years ago, and since then I've been doing tech transactions and advising companies on IP and technology.
Yeah. So a bit about history. We had the privilege to be around the logging and observability space for the past 6 years. Kind of seen this little war between Elasticsearch and AWS Rise. I will start by describing a little, how Elastic started, reminding us all that Elasticsearch itself is based on open source. It's based on Lucene. Shai Benin started that project around 2008 and built a nice way to dynamically map data and index it, so it's easily queried. What was so great and still great about Elasticsearch is that it's an index that is so easy to start. You just install it and start sending data, and the data gets indexed and dynamically mapped into different types of data and all, which is great. The project itself was launched around 2010. And very quickly got a massive community around it. I still remember the latest days of the war between Apache Solr and Elastic in 2014. Now we know that Elastic kind of took over real nice, and I even remember the days of the war between Kibana and Graylog, and that's also pretty much a done war. By 2012, the founding team of Elastic understood the opportunity to capitalize on this great technology that they've built, and they founded Elastic BV and started providing services around the offering of Elastic, and people that deployed Elastic and wanted help with scale, security, features. Elasticsearch raised its Series B at 2014, about $70 million, and really started growing nicely and created an offering called XPAC. XPAC was a premium offer on top of the Elastic Stack. You would get access to XPAC if you bought the premium support license, or if you use the Elastic Cloud service. And it had a lot of features that were critical for enterprises, whether it's RBAC support or security features or audit support or alerting or integrations. It was pretty good and started to catch on. And then Amazon saw how great Elastic was and created their own offering of hosted Elastic. Basically, not a SaaS service, but a hosted Elasticsearch of servers managed by AWS at a cloud type of pricing, which means that you pay per core. Made a lot of sense and resonated with a lot of people that wanted to quickly drain all their data from all the different apps and services that they have on their AWS account into Elasticsearch and enjoy all the benefits of the ELK stack, including the indexing, searching, the APIs, and of course, Kibana. Also important to mention that Kibana and Logstash themselves were not part of Elastic at the beginning. There were separate open source projects. Elasticsearch hired their top engineers and kind of took over those projects and made the ELK stack that we know, Elastic, Logstash, Kibana. At 2017, Elasticsearch made a move to make the XPack open code, not open source, but Elastic license code, so anyone can use it for free without using it commercially or offering it to third parties or offering it as SaaS. And what started happening there is that whenever AWS tried to contribute into the open source version of Elasticsearch, anything that will collide with the Elasticsearch commercial offer, whether it's XPack or Elasticsearch Cloud, naturally Elasticsearch would be slow to approve those PRs, and Amazon was getting frustrated by that and decided in 2019, after they were fearing that it's becoming more and more complex for them to actually identify what is open source and what's not, they decided to create the Open Distro, which is not a fork of Elastic, but is a project that is basically the same bins as Elastic, the same code, but it's a whole lot of packages and plugins to Kibana and Elasticsearch that enable many of the features that XPack had and Amazon couldn't offer to their customers, such as alerting and RBAC and Matrix and different integrations and webhooks and so on. And then there was a big fight between Elastic and AWS up to the point where it was actually litigated, and there are I think still a few lawsuits open between AWS and Elastic. And at some point, Elastic decided to adopt the SSPL created by MongoDB in the past. That is, Mongo tried to register it as open source, but it sort of got rejected by the OSI. And currently it's free to use, but not open source. Like Chris mentioned, it shouldn't affect many of Elasticsearch users, but some of them should be worried about it, or at least consult their corporate lawyer. Now it's dual version. There's two different types of licenses. Either you download the open source part or you download the Elasticsearch license version. Both now are not open source, and both now have some questions. And part of this session, we'll have an open panel where any of you guys can talk a bit about his use case. You don't have to mention a company or too many details, but generally, how do you guys use Elastic? And ask Gal here whether it's perfectly fine, or you might need further consulting or further drilling into this to understand if you have a problem. There we are. So I think this session's purpose is to get everyone comfortable. There was a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And we'll have a quick explanation of what it is in general, and then make it an open Q&A session.
Thank you very much, Ariel. So I think there's one or 2 points there to sort of pick apart. We kind of knew a change was coming, right? But did Elastic ever make a commitment about this? Like, did they ever really firmly say?
That's a good point, actually. So when Elasticsearch created the Elastic license, they explained what it is, and they said that Elasticsearch Core and Kibana Core are Apache license, and will always remain that way. It's not on the website anymore, but good thing that there's the archives of the indexes, so we can actually track that down and use it. It's a legitimate, that's not an objective point of view, but it's a legitimate move to change licenses. I do think that there were a lot of people contributing into that community, and making that sort of statement that it will always be open source and then changing is it's something that you wouldn't expect a company to do.
Yeah. And is Coralogix kind of changing its roadmap at all to sort of reflect this, or?
That's also a good point. I think anyone in the Elastic space is some sort of affected, anyone that in the observability space, but we're not directly affected by the change of license. Coralogix started to move off Elastic a long time ago. All our services, all the unique services that are like XPack services are detached from Elastic. They're all ran in real time. We're building streams with Kafka and RocksDB for stateful sets. So we're not really disturbed by this. And also Coralogix is one of the first partners of the open distro, actually official partner on their partners page. And open distro just announced that they're going all in and forking Elastic and creating Amazon's open source version of Elastic. It's funny how two tech giants fight this battle of who's the one to feel sorry for. I think one argument that I saw, and I would love it if you give like a quick overview of all the buzz on the internet about this. But on one of the discussions, someone said, Amazon stole Elastic and gave services and hurt their revenue. And someone said, yeah, poor little Elasticsearch. It's kind of funny, that situation.
So there are questions coming through already. So I'm not sure if anyone on the panel knows this. I certainly don't. But if Pete Wilcox asked, if I recall, wasn't even SSL locked behind XPack originally? I don't know that off the top of my head.
There were a few. What was the inflection point for me and what made us partner with Open Distro? There were a few very trivial stuff that were moved out of the open source. For instance, HDR histograms. So when you're doing sampling and you want to create histograms, and Elasticsearch knew how to solve this. This is the very core of a database to present HDR histograms, and it was taken out. Another thing that kind of made us worried and decide to move off Elastic is SQL queries that were introduced in the open source version and then taken out of the open source version and into XPack, which was a move that we really didn't like. And so I think that a lot of trivial stuff, and also the SAML that is mentioned, definitely a lot of very trivial stuff were not open source to begin with, or moved from open source to Elastic license, which kind of showed the direction that Elasticsearch would take this eventually. Thank you.
And one last question from Aidan there. Do you feel this will affect how the official Elasticsearch fork version of Elasticsearch are supported by the open source community?
Yeah, so there are so many people that contributed so much to Elastic. I know about a few interesting bugs that Coralogix reported to Elasticsearch back in the days, and or a lot of things that people contributed and created for Elasticsearch, for Kibana, for Logstash, and I think these people will be reluctant to do so in the future. If there are open sources, and there are other commercial companies that are now taking the open source path with Elastic, I think people will contribute there. Luckily for Elastic, they're a big company now, and they don't need the community that much. And they can, they're already in the past few years, Elasticsearch is by far the biggest contributor. So now, instead of a community-driven project, this is going to probably become a fight between Elasticsearch engineering and AWS engineering. So it's going to be interesting.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't matter how big Elastic is, I suppose. You're never really bigger than Amazon, are you? But there are a couple of questions coming through about license violations and stuff. We'll get onto that very, very shortly. So we'll keep those questions on the list. And we'll get to those as soon as we're talking about the sort of details of the SSPL license itself. One of the things that we mentioned there was that organizations are having to change their roadmaps to sort of handle this change in the license. Any corporate lawyer that you speak to will be suitably nervous about this, or at least have some concerns and want to read the details. So users have responded quite seriously. So users ranging from companies who are having to invest a great deal of money that was probably allocated elsewhere into potentially shifting into open distro or something else. But individual users who they made their own open source contributions in their own spare time, believing that they were contributing to the community and believing that they were essentially, it was a good act. And if they were profiting from Elasticsearch, in some way in their commercial sense. They were spending some time to give back to the original product in some way that kind of balanced the scales. And now to find out that actually that open source contribution they've made willingly has kind of been taken and now is now part of a sort of more commercial offering. That came up a great deal on social media. There's a lot of people very, very upset about that. I think it kind of speaks to the sort of philosophical underpinnings of open source, right? That we're doing one thing for everyone, and it's for everyone. It's no strings attached kind of thing. It's kind of available. And when you start adding strings to that, you start damaging trust, and it starts to create a sort of a counter movement, if you like. And that might be the thing that fuels open distros' greater and greater rise with this fork, is people not just doing it because it's interesting or it has features that are attractive, but they're doing it because it's not the Elasticsearch version. Sorry, it's not the Elastic version, just because it's the open source alternative. I think it's raised interesting questions amongst users about, well, what other open source software am I going to have to change away from now? But luckily, a great number of vendors have come out over the past few days, and they've been very, very clear. They have no intention of shifting. So yeah, I think all in all, the user response has been very mixed. There are some people, to give a fair sort of balanced sort of assessment of this, that were actually quite happy about it. They felt it as a way of sticking it to Amazon a little bit, because Amazon are making all this money and they're a huge company, and now they get something bad happens to them, and everyone likes to see the big guy take a hit every now and then. So, there were quite a few people who are quite happy about it, and they saw it as Elastic defending themselves and defending what is ostensibly a community project. Albeit by doing that, they turned it into a commercial offering. But, it's kind of so you either fight in the battle a little bit, can sometimes make you do things that are slightly unpleasant, but you can sort of see why they've made that decision.
Yeah.
So yeah, the user response, all in all, high level, mixed, to say the least, but definitely leaning towards feelings of unhappiness and definitely some disruption in the user base.
I see
there's an interesting
questions. Yeah, I see a few.
Yeah, loads. Yeah. Let's dig into them.
You see a real alternative to Elasticsearch, whether Elastic or AWS fork. I think Elasticsearch is a giant now, and it has so many different use cases that it can serve. The fork of Elasticsearch by AWS, I think, is a decent alternative. There's a big team there. I will say that Elasticsearch for AWS is a very big business that creates a lot of revenue, probably more revenue than Elasticsearch sells on cloud. So I'm not seeing it being neglected anytime soon. They have promised that it will always remain Apache license. Important to mention that the guy who founded Open Distro for AWS is Andy Gutmans. Andy is one of the pioneers of open source in the world. He was a member of the Apache Foundation. He was the founder of Zend, one of the first companies to open source entirely, and he's a big believer in that. There was a mention that Amazon has a lot of open source projects. Some of them, MariaDB is a great example on how the fork version is better than the original. So depending on how important it is to them, we know that infrastructure is something that AWS knows how to do very well. And as a company that knows Elasticsearch very well in Coralogix, I can say that there are a lot of things that Elasticsearch doesn't do very good in terms of scale, in terms of robustness, in terms of how easy it is to maintain. And if a company that does such great infrastructure and such great managed services takes over Elastic and makes it something that is easy to manage and easy to scale, I think we'll all benefit. And in general, putting my Coralogix hat aside and speaking as part of the community that enjoys Elastic, this is like any consumer, competition is great for us. So it's going to accelerate the development of Elasticsearch. It's going to accelerate the development of the Open Distro, and it's going to accelerate other versions that will be forked, I guess, very soon by other companies. So we'll all benefit from better Elastic, better service. And I'm sure that both Open Distro and Elastic will be quicker to answer PRs or other questions now, because they're kind of competing for our attention at the end of the day. So that's essentially a good sign.
And there's one interesting question there is, do we know how large the AWS Elastic team is that will be supporting the fork version?
I'm saying it's a very big business for AWS. I kind of know the number, but I'm not sure that if I should share it. It's not a small team, and it's an important project for them, and it's going to be maintained very well. And I gave examples of projects that were forked by AWS and are better than the original. You think companies or individuals or
That's a philosophical question, that one.
we can address this later on.
Yeah.
How many pieces in the team? If you read the book on how they met AWS. And one last thing before we hand it off to Gal to actually speak educated things about this. I will say that as a user, what concerns me the most is the gradual change of license from we're an open source company, everything's open, to yeah, we have a premium offer, which is legit. Yeah, we have an open offer, but it's not open source. It's under the Elastic license. Oh, wait, but we will never change the core. Oh, wait, we decided to change the core. That means that if I build on Elastic and if I run on Elastic, if I build around Elastic, one day they might actually change the closed source entirely as a whole and say, we're just like Splunk. And, you know, even if they tell me now, we will never do that, you guys just said 2 years ago, you will never change the Apache license. So that's kind of, I think, breaking the trust of the community. I think MongoDB also done that move, but it wasn't that dramatic because Mongo is great, but not a lot of companies were founded around Mongo. It was not like a household name in every single tech company. About copyleft, Apache doesn't include copyleft, correct? That is, I'll leave the last question to Gal when we get there.
So there are a great deal of license questions. Promise we'll address them in just a few minutes. But first, I suppose the most pertinent question, the most common theme through all these questions is, do I need to move? Do I need to do something here? That's really common. So maybe there isn't a problem for you, but to avoid any panic, Gal is here to give us a bit of a run through about the SSPL license, what it means, and how it differs from the Apache V2 license. So Gal, take it away.
Hi, thanks. So I understand we have a mixed audience of non-lawyers. So some new, some to open source, some more knowledgeable. So I'll try to keep this at a fairly high level without getting too much legalese. So to get to the SSPL, I need to start from the beginning. And the beginning is, what is open source? And open source in one sentence is open source software is software that is provided under license terms that include source code access and allow the recipients to use, modify, and distribute the code. Now, there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of open source licenses. Some are very permissive and impose very few restrictions on the open source software, generally require attribution notices to be included, warranty disclaimers to be included, but that's pretty much it. And on the other side of the scale, there are licenses that are a lot more restrictive and impose significant restrictions that can affect the recipient's rights in its own modifications or proprietary code. Now, the more restrictive licenses actually require that any distribution of the open source would include source code, both for the original code and for any modifications or derivative works that the user creates. I would say that most open source licenses I would classify into three general categories, and we'll see in a moment where the SSPL fits. The first bucket or the first category is the permissive licenses. Those are licenses like the BSD, which was the original Unix license, and the MIT license. I'm sure you've heard of them. And those licenses allow the maximum freedom in using the source code to create modified versions and derivative work. And it includes the freedom to take open source software under the BSD or BSD type licenses and use it to create proprietary programs and not provide source code for those programs. You could, but you don't have an obligation to. That's why many companies consider them safe to use, but it's not what many in the open source community prefer. So there's no obligation to contribute back. Now, the two other buckets or categories are of restrictive licenses. I would call one strong copyleft and the other weak copyleft. The strong copyleft include licenses like the GPL, the General Public License, which I'm pretty sure you've heard of, created by Richard Stallman of the Free Software Foundation, probably 30 years ago or so. It was used for Linux and, thousands or maybe hundreds of thousands of projects in the world. And so the GPL and similar strong copyleft licenses are designed to prevent developers from modifying open source software without contributing back the modifications to the community. And it's on the opposite end of the scale of the spectrum, from BSD type licenses. If BSD licenses permit essentially unlimited commercial use of the open source, GPL does not. It contains a number of fairly complicated terms and conditions. Those open source licenses are not easy to read and understand. But I would say that among those complicated terms, the key ones, at least for this discussion, are that programs licensed under the GPL must be distributed without a fee and with the source code made available to all licensees. And the other term that is key is that derivative works of a GPL program must also be distributed. If they're distributed, they must be distributed pursuant to the same terms, meaning source code and no fee. Now, these provisions, combined with the very broad interpretation of what counts as a derivative work, results in what's often called or so-called a viral effect of the GPL. It's the contamination or the viral effect, which means that the GPL may impact any code that is derived from or combined with the result that code, the resulting code, must be distributed pursuant to the same terms. So that's the strong copyleft bucket. And lastly, the weak copyleft bucket, probably in between the permissive and the strong copyleft. The weak copyleft are a number of licenses like the Mozilla Public License and the lesser General Public License, which is the LGPL. They're derived from the GPL, or I should say inspired by the GPL. And like the GPL, they require that any modifications to the code be licensed under the same terms and provided in the source. But unlike the GPL, the weak copyleft licenses generally permit that the license code could be combined with separate proprietary files which do not need to be contributed in source. That's at a very, very high level. There are differences between all these licenses, but those are the three buckets I would kind of choose to describe. I would add one thing that I think Ariel mentioned earlier, that many companies, many developers release their software under a dual licensing scheme where the user could choose between a commercial license or a proprietary license for commercial use, or an open source license, which is often for non-commercial use or for limited applications. And that's what Elastic and others have done for many years. Now, how does SAS and SSPL fit into and play into all of this? The trigger to many of those viral obligations, which I mentioned, the viral meaning, releasing the source code of derivative works, the viral obligations are triggered by distribution of the code. But the term distribution is often not defined in those licenses. And even if it is defined, it's not clear. It's hard to understand and doesn't always meet reality. And this can be very important when using open source software in a SaaS or a cloud-based business model, because in a typical SaaS model, a copy of the code is not given to the customer. Rather, the customers actually access the code through a network connection. So there's no delivery of the code, of the software, there's no distribution, and it doesn't trigger most of those restrictive licenses. So as a result, most open source licenses, under most open source licenses, the deployment of SaaS models do not trigger those copyleft provisions, and the modified version of the code, which the user modifies, do not need to be made available in the source. So how did the industry address that? The first, or the not necessarily the first, but the most important step before SSPL was the Affero GPL, known as the AGPL. It's almost identical to the version 3, the version 3 of the GPL, but it was designed specifically to ensure that even if the modified source code is accessed via a network and not distributed, a copy is not provided to the user, it would still become available or need to be made available to the community in source code. Now, to be specific, section 13 of the AGPL, and you'll see in a moment how the SSPL is different from that. So section 13 of the AGPL says that if a licensee runs a modified software, licenses software under AGPL and modifies it and runs it on a server and allows users to interact with it remotely through a network, then the source code corresponding to that modified version must be made available at no charge and in source code. That helped close that loophole, which I mentioned, where there is no distribution, and Mongo and many others have used AGPL. MongoDB stopped using it in October 2018 when they switched to the SSPL, which they created. Now, where's the problem? Why is AGPL not sufficient? Why does it not solve this problem? And the answer lies, again, in what Ariel started describing. It's a large cloud providers that have found ways to commercialize many popular open source projects in their cloud environments, and without having to bear any of the engineering costs of maintaining or updating or upgrading the code, and without having to give anything back to the community. Now, their business model obviously focuses on offering managed services such as customizations, integration, maybe some service levels to projects that are freely available as source code, as open source, but charging a fee for it, for those add-on managed services. And companies build a big business around it. Red Hat and many others throughout the past 2 decades. Now, AGPL is not enough to capture those service scenarios. The commercial cloud providers rarely modify the code, the open source code, I mean. And if they do, releasing the corresponding source code of the modifications do not really affect their proprietary interests or even the revenue flow. And arguably the open source projects do not directly benefit from these cloud providers. They typically rely on revenue from their enterprise tier solutions. Again, similar to Elastic, where you can buy a proprietary code, a proprietary license, or an open source license. Those companies make money usually based off their enterprise tier license. Now, and also obviously those open source projects usually do not have the scale or ability to effectively withstand competition from the Amazons of the world that launch the open source platform through their own service. That's where the service-side public license, the SSPL, comes to the rescue. So MongoDB and other organizations, but Mongo specifically created the SSPL. There are some other licenses that are similar to the SSPL, at least with what they try to achieve. But today we're going to talk about the SSPL. So SSPL, created in 2018 by Mongo, is very, very similar to the Affero GPL, the AGPL. Section 13, which I mentioned 2-3 minutes ago, was changed in the SSPL. And it's the only provision actually that was substantially changed, is substantially different from the AGPL. Now, what it does under the SSPL, Section 13 requires that anyone who offers a publicly available SSPL product, Mongo or Elasticsearch today, as a service, must also make it available under an open source, must also make available the infrastructure code under the same open source license. And what is the infrastructure code? Actually, the technical term in the license is service source code. That includes everything around the SSPL code. So if AWS were to offer Elasticsearch as a service, the management software, the user interfaces, the APIs, the automation software, monitoring software, backup software, storage, and many other hosting software, all that infrastructure must be also made available in source in a way that a user can run an instance of the service using that code that was made available by Amazon or the other cloud provider.
Gal, this directly relates to one of the questions, that there's a little bit of a distinction that needs to be drawn between SAS, where Kibana and Elasticsearch features are sort of directly exposed, and then they're supported by underlying infrastructure that kind of just keeps that running, their sort of managed service model, versus an organization that uses Elasticsearch to power many of its features. Is there a clear sort of definition in the license that excludes one from having to make its source code available versus the other?
So yes and no. I mean, what Mongo, again, the author of the SSPL, said that they're saying that the copyleft conditions of Section 13 do not apply to SaaS applications that use Mongo as a database and not as an offered service. So if you build an application on top of the underlying SSPL technology, whether it's Mongo or Elasticsearch, arguably it does not apply unless you offer it as a service. Question is, what does it mean to offer as a service, right? What AWS does is clearly offering Mongo as a service. There are many other use cases where I think it's completely gray and we don't know the answer. And I think we can mention a few. Spoke earlier about a company that offers, runs Elasticsearch, not necessarily as a service, but as an outside provider, runs Elasticsearch for a company. Does that make it a service? Unclear. If that same person or company does that for 200 or 1,000 companies, then maybe it is a service. The terms of Section 13 are not clear. All they say, and I have a copy right here.
So to make this clear, if I have a DevOps consultancy and I go to companies and say, guys, I'll deploy and maintain your Elk, and I have 20 customers like that, where whenever they have a problem with their Elk, I manage it, I install it, and they use it. Does that mean that I might be considered as providing services of Elastic, or is it in a gray area?
So I think it's gray. I don't think that's what they intended to capture. Again, the language reads, if you make the functionality of the program, and the program being Elasticsearch here, or a modified version of it, available to third parties as a service, then what we talked about applies. So do you make the functionality of Elastic available? I don't know. I mean, you make Elastic as Elastic available in your example, I think. You didn't change the product, so maybe it's not what they intended to capture. Do you make it available to third parties as a service? Definitely to third parties. Is it as a service? If you're a service provider, I would say maybe yes, but it's not a service provider like AWS. So
yeah.
As I initially said, open source licenses are hard to interpret. They're not very clear. So it's yet to be seen.
You've got to ask yourself quite a difficult existential question, right? Like, am I a service? And, I think that's an interesting tool that people can take away, right? Is that's what you go to your corporate lawyer with, like, are we a service? What does this mean? Is the kind of the essence of it?
I would say, are we an Elastic service? Because you can be a service that builds on Elastic, right? I could as a lawyer, use Elastic maybe for certain services, but I wouldn't provide Elastic services to my clients, right? That's not what I do. Yeah. But in Ariel's example, it is part of the service.
If my website is using Elasticsearch, it's not exposed to the customer, but I'm a retailer. I'm a retailer that sells shoes, and I have a search bar where people search blue shoes and basketball. At the end of the day, Elasticsearch is a search engine. I just added, I just offer Elastic as a service to my customers, and I make revenue of that. And more than that, Elasticsearch even has a website search product, not only the monitoring one. So it seems to me like, to the question from, I think it was Benny Sasson, I think it's fairly gray area. The question is, if I'm using Elastic as backend search engine for a front-end application, that is it a license violation? So it's a backend search engine for a front-end application that his customers use. Is that a violation? What do you think, God?
It's hard to say. I mean, I really think there's no good answer here. I think I'm inclined to say that if it is a back-end search engine that powers a front-end website, toolbar, some other functionality, then I'm inclined to say it isn't offering Elasticsearch as a service. You know, I can argue otherwise. I'm a lawyer. I can argue both ways. But I'm inclined to say it isn't a service, but there is definitely a risk. You know, if your company were to undergo due diligence in connection with an investment or an acquisition, it would be marked as a risk. I can put a number, I can quantify the risk, but there's some risk here. Now, the risk is, one is, does SSPL apply here? And two, what does it apply to? What are we risking? If you wrap that Elasticsearch feature with very sensitive core IP of your company, then the result is greater risk. If it's IP you don't really care about, then smaller risk, right? So it's I would measure it on a case-by-case basis. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer here.
There's a really interesting question that came through actually that kind of touches on this a little bit, but we're all talking about how Elastic have just sort of changed the license and they just sort of made that decision, and it feels kind of unilateral. What sort of legally, what is it that gives them the right to say, all these open source contributions are ours now? Essentially, what enables them to do that?
So legally, you can do anything unless you're restricted from doing so, right? So, they did say, as Ariel mentioned, a number of years ago, that Apache would always be the governing license. I think they just changed the language on the website to Apache would be the governing license until further notice. So it's no longer always. Were they allowed to do that? They are not changing it retroactively. That they cannot do, right? If I bought their product under license X, they cannot tell me on one day it's no longer X, now it's Y. That doesn't work. But they can do so going forward, which is what they did, right? They said, I think version 7.11, right, Ariel? Which is the next version. I think that would already be governed by SSPL, not Apache. So if you want to upgrade or install the next version, you would have to accept that new license. If you continue to use what you already have, that would be under whatever license you bought it originally.
And there's a question, an interesting question actually from Pete here. Do you think companies or individuals are ever justified in deleting or restricting open source code repos for ideological reasons? Is there a moral, commercial line, or does the purity of open source, of open principle hold true? Is that kind of what you wanted to add to, Chris?
Yes, yeah. It's fun, man. It's like these kinds of questions are tough to answer, right? As well, because again, it's really philosophical. Because in my head, I was thinking there's this distinction between stewardship and ownership, right? It's like I promise I'll look after this thing, but if I look after it for long enough, do I own it? Like if I clean my neighbor's house for 10 years, can I just sell his house from under him? Like, there's this, it's an interesting, weird open source sort of situation. There's one question I wouldn't mind answering, because I do not know the answer to this, and it's a tough one. If I have if I offer Docker images that are supported by me and pre-baked, and that's a service that I offer, and within that Docker image, Elasticsearch is contained as software, am I offering Elasticsearch as a service too? No, I came from Claudia in the chat. I think that's a really interesting question, because you are the Elasticsearch software is definitely part of the thing that you're distributing there, and people are making use of that directly. It's not hidden behind your service in any way. Gal, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
That could be the risk. After Mongo made their change, 2 years ago, I think Red Hat were among the first companies to drop Mongo. And I'm not exactly sure how they offered Mongo, but I think it was offered together with their Red Hat product. So they didn't offer Mongo as a service, but it was combined as one product. And made available to their customers. So they dropped Mongo, removed it out of their offering. I think the same would apply here in your scenario, if I understand you correctly. I mean, companies would be hesitant to include Elasticsearch, even though it's not technically offered as a service, per se, but it's part of what they offer. So there is risk.
There's a question that I wanted to address by David Bennett, or a statement. It seems that companies that build products, including Elasticsearch for on-premise implementation rather than cloud SaaS-based offerings, can continue with the SSPL license. If my 2 cents, if you build it internally, Gal would probably be able to confirm. If you build it internally and use it internally and not exposing it to anyone, I assume that this is not a problem.
Correct. If it's really internal use, then there's no problem. If it's internal using, the outside consultant that runs it for you, then we're starting to enter that gray zone. But if it's purely internal, no, I mean, you're not impacted.
You mentioned the open source licenses are often quite difficult to interpret because it's a vague language. Is this an especially vague license, or is this just part of the course to use it?
So I don't know that it's worse than the GPL itself, but it builds on the GPL. So any unclear patch added on earlier patches to an unclear original license creates the whole product very unclear. So fair answers you.
And smart comment by Pete, by David, of course, that right now it's okay. You never know what is going to happen with the next versions, but there's something here to remember. Apache is irrevocable, which means that they cannot change past versions. So until 7.10, anyone using Elastic will always have it open sourced. Mm-hmm. One question, is SSPL also irrevocable, or can I get a message from Elastic saying, hey, we decided to move it to closed source. You cannot use it from now on, and you have 30 days to get off Elastic.
With respect to prior versions, which you already received under SSPL? Is that the question?
Yes, exactly.
I believe it is the same, like irrevocable. You can't change it retroactively. Good question.
One question, Katie, why was SSPL rejected as an open source license?
So it wasn't officially rejected. Mongo tried to register it with OSI. There were a lot of questions by OSI about this, and a lot of doubts regarding whether this would ever be able to be considered as open source. And Mongo kind of gave up during the process, and then Elasticsearch never tried. So it's just not registered as classic.
I would just add on this that I saw a posting by the OSI itself, and they said that SSPL is incompatible with the open source definition, because one of the requirements is that the license must not restrict other software, and the SSPL forces SaaS software that is aggregated with the SSPL software, but it is not a derivative work of it to be open source, and that restricts use of software that is not a derivative work of the originally licensed SSPL software. That's why they say it does restrict software that is remote from the underlying SSPL software. I hope that was clear, but that's what they said.
A question by Stefan. If you build product with Elastic embedded to provide dashboards for monitoring, then is OpenDistro the only way to forward now to avoid? Seems to me like yes, unless you stick to version 7.10. Gal, what do you think?
I'm not sure I followed the question. Can you repeat that?
If you sell a product with Elastic embedded to provide dashboards for monitoring, then is OpenDistro the only way forward now to avoid source code release?
Dashboards for monitoring?
Like exposed dashboards that rely on Elastic and sell it as...
Well, there's an interesting distinction, right? Because it could either be you have your own dashboard solution that's driven by Elastic data, or you have a little iframe that's got Kibana in it, and you've kind of wrapped that in your own product. because they would be very different. I would imagine the one is giving Kibana directly as a service, albeit slightly layered, and the other one is.
Although if you just paint it, if you just paint it differently, but still offer Elastic, or Elastic functionality, then I think the risk is high that the SSPL would apply. This is not kind of a behind-the-scenes scenario that you just use Elastic.
Clarification, it's Kibana itself, so it's even easier. Yeah.
Yeah. I would. That sounds like it's definitely to Bolo Gals a risk. Certainly a risk.
Gal, what happens if I manage it? If I'm an MSSP or I have a managed SOC service that I give people, and it's based on Elasticsearch?
Same answer. I don't know that I can distinguish it from my earlier answer. If you offer Elastic functionality, then I think you're exposed to this license.
And I will say something, not to scare anyone, but just, facts. It may seem like, hey, I'm a small company, Elasticsearch doesn't care about me, and Elasticsearch are really trying to say it's all about Amazon, and Amazon is a giant that's stealing our technology. But I will remind that Elasticsearch sued a tiny company of 10 people in Germany called SearchGuard that had created a security solution for Elasticsearch clusters. And the lawsuit was very not a straightforward one. They said, so SearchGuard had their own code. They said that SearchGuard took a lot of inspiration from the open code of XPack that is not open source and rewritten it to make it a service. And that is why SearchGuard is stealing Elasticsearch's IP, and they sued that tiny company. So they will, if there's something that might disturb their commercial offering, they will go for that.
It's not a David versus Goliath situation, really, is it? It's one massive giant versus a slightly smaller giant.
Exactly. It's still a $15 billion company, and as long as you're not too successful, they shouldn't care most of the time. But if like Gal mentioned, if your small DevOps consultancy becomes Accenture one day and does that for 1,000 companies, and these 1,000 companies tell Elastic, oh, I don't need to buy licenses of support because I have Accenture running Elastic for me, they might go after Accenture and say, hey guys, you're providing Elastic as a service and we have a problem with that. So that's just something to keep in mind, because it's very easy to kind of ignore and say, oh, they don't care about me, I'm too small.
Yeah, absolutely.
If I was journeying out into something new and trying something interesting, my gut feeling would be, if there's any legal dispute around a piece of software that I'm using, I'd be like, I'm just not going to touch it. I'll go and do something else, and that would certainly be my default position now as a software engineer. Why risk the headache, especially when open distro is as advanced as it is now. It's a very, very good alternative.
And life is about taking risks, and there are business considerations always, right? By the way, you mentioned that dispute in Germany. I'm not familiar with the details, but I just want to mention that part of the open source licenses, GPL and SSPL and a fairer GPL, all of these licenses being so kind of hard to interpret and unclear, is that there's almost no case law. Worldwide, there are a handful of cases in the world about interpreting open source licenses. So there is no guidance on what the license means. And situations like the one you described in Germany with SearchGuard, usually, I think, I should say not usually, in 99% of those cases, they end up in a settlement or some arrangement between those parties. I think that German company became a plugin of Elasticsearch. So there's no court decision interpreting the contract, so it remains vague.
Yeah, but if I'm a 10 people company or 100 people company like Coralogix, and I get a massive lawsuit by Elasticsearch on my core IP, that is preventing me. I would be inclined to create a partnership with Elasticsearch and blend in as a plugin, because my fundability now, or a company's willingness to acquire me is pretty much nothing.
Absolutely. It might be a different topic, but sometimes a business strategy. I'm not saying Elastic, not at all, but for companies to initiate lawsuits or sometimes, not baseless, but close to that claims just to get some leverage in negotiations.
Agree.
Somewhat cutthroat, but yeah. Okay, so we overrun on the allotted time by a little bit. If anyone's got any last questions, feel free to throw them in now. We'll just give it maybe 30 seconds, and then we'll probably bring us to the close. So just give it a sec.
Final chance to ask questions, guys.
Yeah.
Typing.
It was our pleasure, guys. It was really, really interesting. I mean, to be honest, as a software engineer, I'm just happy to be able to ask an IP lawyer some stuff. Is a good question. Is there anything guaranteeing the openness of Open Distro?
No, actually, no. The only thing that's guaranteeing the openness of Open Distro is that we assume that AWS doesn't care, because AWS sells infrastructure, not the code and not the software. So AWS also today with Elasticsearch, they're just selling you the machines where Elasticsearch is deployed. And that's what they mainly care about. And for them, it's more interesting to kind of get the community from Elasticsearch rather than creating a product that will compete. It's not their main business selling indexes.
There's one question waiting. Just if we offer on-premise management solutions for ES, for Elasticsearch, will it violate terms? I think we kind of covered that a little bit before.
That one. Generally, no. If you're big enough, might. It's kind of gray area.
Good answer.
I'm getting better at this, yeah.
This is really just an opportunity for Ariel and I to get loaded degrees.
Yeah, God, this is the answer to any question, any legal question, right? Like generally, no, might be yes, needs further assessment. That always is correct.
You forgot it depends.
All right, thanks everyone. Thanks a lot, Gal, for joining us from HFN and giving us your perspective and sharing from your experience.
Thank you for inviting me.
And I'll hand it over to Chris to wrap up.
You did a very, very good job for me, Ariel. Thank you. So thank you very much for attending. We do these webinars monthly. So the next one will be in 23, I think it's the 24th of February is the, and there's one tomorrow as well. So tomorrow is the security webinar. Thank you for that. You just reminded me, Ariel. So tomorrow is the security webinar, and we're talking all about thinking like a hacker and approaching your infrastructure and your software as if you were coming at it from a malicious position, and how you can use that to fortify your infrastructure and your software. Next month, we're going to be talking about machine learning. And that's going to be a whole different ballgame. So thank you very much for your time. And thank you so much for all the questions. You're really, really good. And yes, and once again, thank you, Ariel and Gal.
Thank you.